Yes.
What do you think the relationship, let's try to find out what truth is by sort of relating it to something else, for instance, to poetry. Because in Plato, for instance, there's this idea that poets are dangerous to society because of their ability to create basically illusions and utopias and get people to believe in those ideas that are false. And so for the philosopher apparently is the one who has access to the truth, or is the one you know who I think is a realist in that he looks at facts, not sort of fantasies. But also, if you are not faithful to the truth, you also are a sophist, right? And the sophist is the man who twists and turns phrases in order to get to a result that convinces people of whatever is in the sophist's interests. So it's like manipulating other people, right, into believing something that is not real. So I guess what I'm trying to get at here is truth reality, or can we know reality? You see what I mean?
Yes, it's a very difficult question, and we both love Merleau-Ponty, and I remember Merleau-Ponty's comment in the preface, I think, to Phenomenology of Perception, that we are in the truth, which I think must be something like nous sommes dans la vérité in French. Makes sense for a phenomenologist to say that. But I mean, this is kind of a rough and ready and clumsy description, but we're perhaps more transcendentalists than phenomenologists, although we love and learn from phenomenology. So I'm not sure we are in the truth necessarily. I don't know if we can actually say that. Although I remember when I first read that in Merleau-Ponty, I was very impressed and agreed with it as obviously true. But obviously, as you turn these comments over the years, you think, well, maybe that's not quite as true as it seemed. There are some assumptions built in there about we're in the truth, and then when you question the assumptions, these things that led you to believe that you had a certain knowledge of something when you don't. I suppose maybe that answers the question in a way that the only thing we can be certain of is that we are in a rather uncertain state of knowledge and understanding. I think we agree that ultimate truth and reality resides outside of this sphere. We're probably quite Kantian or even Platonic in this way. So this is sort of a very fine but kind of corruptible realm where we can perhaps glimpse truth in these sort of hierophanic moments, to use Eliade's word.
I am the way, the truth, and life. This sort of thing. Yeah, I think you're right. It's also a theophany of sorts, and an epiphany. Epiphanies are usually enlightening moments where you get to know something, but the way you know it is not necessarily through a process that is, I suppose, repeated. I think it's just more like a flash of something. It's like revealed truth, like you receive it, like you can never get to know it on your own. And I think this is where Socrates is really contradicting everyone else, because he claims to be able to bring us closer to the truth by allowing us to admit our ignorance concerning major issues, major themes. And I think that his method of questioning ourselves and each other, I think basically laid the foundation for science as we know it today. Science basically only creates bigger questions based on the answers that are provided. And I think the more we know, the less we know in a way. Of course, it's very difficult the way we find ourselves in the situation where, if we are in this position to talk about it, we feel as if it's very difficult for us to say what it is or what it is not. But if we don't ask ourselves these questions, it's almost as if what Merleau-Ponty said is true. It's like being in the world and talking about, just life is the truth.
Yeah.
That our asking this question is in many ways an exercise in futility, if you will. It's just not productive in any way. It's sort of there. Whatever is the truth. But of course, there are many ways of looking at it, at this issue. I suppose the truth for a scientist is the fact, whereas for us as poets, I think, the truth is something a lot more subjective, a lot more personal, a lot more, like I said before, it's revealed truth. It's our own life experience. At least that's my view.
Yes.
So, what are your thoughts on this relationship between truth and poetry, poetic truth? Or
Yes, well, I think you do right to distinguish between a kind of poetic truth and a scientific truth. And again, as with so many things, the confusion can come down to how we use and misuse words. You often hear scientists and pseudoscientists talking about the truth of this or that subject. And really, I wish they would use the word verity, because then they would be talking about veritas, and that I think that could be used to signify the fact, that thing which is done and almost tangible and reliable, the evidence, test tube, the test tube evidence, that sort of thing that's arrived at via induction and so forth. I think the word truth, relates to the word troth. I plight my troth to you. It's more about trust and faith, and I think poetry really takes charge of truth, and science takes care of verity. And I suppose we were also talking about theophanic truth or hierophanic truth. I think the Greek word for truth there would be very useful, aletheia, or aletheia or something. I don't know the exact pronunciation. And you can tell from that a prefix that it's a negative state. It's that sort of idea of something being discovered, uncovered. It's revelatory. Like with atheism, it's aletheia. So we use this word truth, but we don't. We kind of leap into it before we've really agreed on what truth actually is. And it's one of those. It's often the simple monosyllabic words that trip us up the most, and we want to. We do well to stop, set out different possibilities of meaning, and agree on what we're talking about. So I think we are roughly of the same opinion that there is a sort of subjective, poetic, almost emotional truth. And then a sort of more scientific facticity.
So are you here somehow suggesting that people should allow themselves to be, in a sense, fooled by the poet, that they should sort of trust the poet, or agree to the game, if you will, to sort of try to turn off their I suppose they're scientifically minded thinking, and then just to sort of embrace this convention or something like that. It's like because it's a completely different field of knowledge, isn't it?
Yes. Although at the same time, we also do well to read skeptically. Because we might be reading a lousy poet, or we might be reading someone who claims that he or she is a poet, and actually they're terrible. And if we all accept that everyone who even tries their hand at poetry is good, then we won't have a canon of good poetry, and we'll just have a lot of sort of...
So how can you tell when something is poetry and when something is not poetry, what is the truth about that? How can you tell true poetry from fake poetry? Because there are a lot of people who try to hide behind that mask of, anything can be poetry. I just write a word on a piece of paper and that is poetry.
Yes.
What makes poetry in the sense that, how do I get people to believe that what they're reading is actually true poetry as opposed to just, sophisticated nonsense, or the sophist poet, the person who wants to trick someone into believing that they're a poet without actually being one. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I suppose poetry does change its parameters and rules all the time. But at the same time, it's also an old business, the poetry business, and it's been largely the same. So there's obviously some sort of stable criterion or set of criteria or something like that for what makes a good poem. I would definitely subscribe to Catullus's idea of the doctus poeta, the poet who has learned his or her craft, and I think you can see that when there's poetic technique, you that's something you cannot fake, and I think that's a very good test. It may not be the only test, and also there may be naive poetry, say folk poetry, ballads, things like that, that's very, very good, but is not technically all that sophisticated, but it might have a fire or an immediacy or something like that. And there are probably very fine poets out there who are worth reading, who don't have great technique. Maybe Longfellow. He has quite good technique.
I was wondering about the role of the reader, or indeed the listener in case of recited poetry. So, what if the reader or the listener buys into the idea that it is poetry, believes that it is poetry, and to them it actually triggers a response that perhaps poetry does trigger in some people. So I guess what I'm trying to get at here is, how much does the effect of a certain poet or poem matter in this equation? I mean, because you could have, for instance, cases where someone says, "Oh, this is remarkable poetry," but you just don't know it. You just can't see it. Whereas in other cases, perhaps it's the other way around. You see my point?
Yeah, my worry would be like Kant's worry with subjective moral evaluations. That if that's how we test it, then all discussions of morality will be nothing more than people expressing their personal opinions, and there will be no objective morality. And that's a shortcut to hell in Kant's book, and I think I would probably agree with him. And I think similarly for art, you need some kind of attempt at objectivity, even if it's a failed attempt. It's probably more important to have a failed attempt at objective criteria for judgment than for actually writing it, or painting it, or making it, or crafting it in some way like that. And you can have these very generous definitions. Oh, poetry comes from the Greek poiesis, so it's just making, which is what the Greek word means. So if I make anything, if I, make you a table or a chair, that's poetic. Well, yes, literally it's poetic, and it probably required more technique than goes into most poems. But I think that makes the definition so general and vague as to be meaningless, and poetry is the business of making meaning. So we need a meaningful definition of what it actually is, and I think we can make it reasonably wide to let a lot of things in, and then we can reject a lot of the garbage. We have to separate the wheat from the chaff. And maybe this happens over in a more organic way over a long period of time. The people who it does seem that there is a section of a society that becomes the sort of arbiter elegantiarum, and judges seem almost naturally to be appointed, or naturally to appoint themselves. And maybe it can fail. I think some poets have been remembered as better than they are. And sometimes it's probably that disagreement amongst the informed, maybe that sort of vigorous discussion amongst the informed people is a good thing. But I think we can all agree that it's better for a few people who obsessively read poetry and do it day in and day out to decide these things, than for a builder who takes no interest in literary things, or take your pick, a waitress who takes no interest in literary things and is just reading Jackie Collins or something. There's a sort of natural appointment, maybe appointed by nature herself, perhaps. I don't know.
Yeah, selective affinities. You find the people who share your love of poetry, and I think that's the word, right? Love for the truth, but also love for the poetic truth that we can. We can fail at that, at really knowing that poetic truth, really getting to, I suppose, to live with it. I mean, the idea that you can recite poetry to me is very, very interesting, because the role, the task of the poet in ancient times was, in many ways, to be the carrier of an entire message, of a culture, and that has also been lost, because now we have, of course, the internet, we have television, we have so many other ways of it being, informed. And I think that what the poet had, what the bard had, was the ability to make it a personal truth rather than an objective type of truth, I think. I don't know, I mean, what is your view, what are your views concerning the relationship between the maker, the poet as maker? There is actually a book called Dante the Maker, so, the maker of poetry and the actual poem itself. Can you separate the poem from the author, and if so, how does that affect the value of the poem as an artifact? Because I, for instance, as reader, I always try to think of the biography of the poet. To me, that is almost as important and as the poetry, because it's organic, it's human. Whereas these days, people are talking about computers, algorithms, things that can artificially create poetry, basically, achieving a similar effect in the minds of readers, that could be made to look like a certain poem. Like they have actually been doing this with, I think, Shakespearean sonnets, where they, put the data in a computer, and then the computer sees the pattern, and there's a pattern there, and then comes up with new things that are in that same vein. And Shakespeare scholars were asked to tell the difference between the real ones and the computer versions of it, and they were successful in doing so, because there was something more in the ones that were authored by Shakespeare himself. There was more, I wouldn't say logic, but more meaning, like you said. That the way in which we use words is different from the way in which words are used on a computer and things like that. So there's more meaning there. But yeah, how do you see things in terms of almost the personality cult of the poet? I mean, the poet used to be and still is, I suppose, I imagine, a very important member in a society.
Yes, and the Romans
Mm.
honoured the poet with that title, Vates, the sort of prophet or seer,
Mm.
which is a much more exalted name than the Greek poet. But we've gone for poet in English rather than prophet. But I think we were saying the other day, Hölderlin is a great example of a prophetic poet, especially in that sort of mid to late work before his madness, and even after his sort of breakdown into madness, there's still a great prophetic strain in his work. Well, one of the best poems in English is the medieval poem Pearl, anonymous author, but it's written in the first person, and it's achingly personal poetry about, well, it's a dream vision in which the poet sees again his dead daughter. She is the pearl of the poem, and you don't know whether it's completely fictionalized or if it's rigorously true to that poet's personal emotions about this daughter who was taken from him too young. Thinking about that, it makes me realise that when we read, we probably are constructing a biography. Because if you think about it, I know almost nothing really about Dante or Catullus or Ovid, but you get such a personal sense from all of their work. Maybe not so much in the Metamorphoses of Ovid, but in his other works where he talks about himself a lot. But I don't actually, I didn't know these people. I don't know what they did day to day or anything like that. I don't know what they looked like or anything. Oh, we have an idea what Dante looked like, I suppose. So really, the actual historical person of the poet is always very far away and misty. But perhaps a more, maybe even a truer sense of who they really were comes through in their poetry. Proust said that our social personalities are the productions of others. Maybe poetry allows the poet to transcribe his or her true self in a way that would not be possible otherwise. So perhaps there's a mode of truth in that, or maybe an autobiographical truth.
So by writing, or through poetry, we get to know ourselves. Is that what you're saying? Know thyself, that sort of thing. Because if you remember that Socrates, in that dialogue, the death of Socrates, when he starts writing, he never writes. He never wrote anything. But then near the end of his life, well, I think this is also Plato, creating this image. But it's an interesting image. Why would Socrates want to write something? I think it was a play or poetry or something.
Was he versifying Aesop? I
think your memory may be better than mine in these things. But what if, the writing of poetry is that way of knowing thyself, knowing yourself, your true self.
Yes. We were going for a definition of poetry earlier, and I went for technique. Maybe in order to write real poetry, you need to know yourself beforehand. Maybe when you're still bad at writing poetry, you don't quite know yourself. But once you know yourself, maybe you can write.
Finding that what Ezra Pound called virtu, that sort of thing, and that thing that makes you you.
Virtu.
That thing that keeps you sort of, that gives you your uniqueness. I think that's what, in many ways, that the truth is not necessarily a series of absolutes, but it's something that can be subjective truth, and it can be your truth rather than trying to establish a universal sort of truth to be accepted by all. Interesting, yes. So what are your thoughts concerning the idea that, because of course scientists believe that in this universal truth, right, that it doesn't matter what culture you come from, the sun, the earth, the planets, the universe, it's all the same. But when we discuss poetry, of course, these things changed a little bit. So you have Western culture, you have Oriental culture, you have African culture, you have all these cultures. And I'm thinking now of these anthologies that try to bring together all the poetry of the world and say, this is poetry and this is poetry. My question would be, is it poetry? Is all of this the same poetry? Or does it vary? Because the poetic this poetic truth that we're talking about, is it universal? Is it as universally valid as the scientific one? Or?
Hard to say. Well, there are deep questions here about poetry and the culture of that poetry. So I suppose the things I've been saying have been Western European ideas from my lifetime reading Western European